Hello and welcome to the Yarning Circle. In today's video log, I'm going to be discussing the topic of Indigenous education, specifically pertaining to the core theme of country and story, and its integration within the curriculum. Before I further break down and explore this topic, I would like to show my respect with an acknowledgement of country. We pay our respects to the Turrbal people, who are the traditional custodians of the land, as well as elders past, present and emerging, for they hold the memories, the traditions, the culture and hopes of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples across the state. A better understanding and respect for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures develops an enriched appreciation of Australia's cultural heritage and can lead to reconciliation. This is essential to the maturity of Australia as a nation and fundamental to the development of an Australian identity. So, as previously stated, I'm going to be discussing the topic of country and story within an Indigenous context, and we'll be exploring the relevance and significance of this theme within a schooling environment. How can this focus area inform a school learning and social environment that is both purposeful and influential in its promotion of inclusion and active engagement with Indigenous students and their culture? Furthermore, what are the specific strategies that could be implemented to enhance such a process within a classroom? These two notions of thought will be examined and evaluated throughout this presentation. How will this be done? Three elements that will be addressed throughout this log. One, I will reflect upon my own preconceived understanding of country and story, and from there I will critically analyse this theme through extensive research. The second, I will examine the significance of country and story and its relevance to my future role as a teacher. And the last step of all, I will identify a range of strategies that can be implemented in order to enhance the effectiveness of classroom teaching in relation to the key concepts of inclusion and active engagement of and with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students and the wider community. Our first topic of discussion is a reflection and critical analysis of country and story. Upon reflection of the research I have done throughout this unit, I have developed a deeper connection with not just Indigenous culture, but also the manner in which Indigenous Australians form their identity. When reflecting upon prior research into the element of country, I found a profound connection between Aboriginal identity and the land on which they live. Within a documentary named Remaking the Pathway, found on NITV, an Aboriginal woman by the name of Batumbel speaks of a concept of reciprocity between human and land. This reciprocity can be exemplified through the idea that having the ability to find food and look after one another was and still is a direct result of how they treat the land. How people and land are united as part of one identity. She spoke of how the touch of the rain against her skin is often soft on the senses, but before the cyclone was sharp on the skin, leaving a stinging warning of what was to come. This could only be known through a deeply embedded consciousness within the land. Upon deeper investigation, storytelling was another component of Indigenous identity I found prevalent amongst Aboriginals. In prior assessment of this unit, I discovered a broadcast, also from NITV, called First Nation Bedtime Stories, and this informed me of storytelling being utilised as a cornerstone of fundamental purpose in Aboriginal life. The discussion within the documentary spoke of storytelling as a way of conveying deep connections between Aboriginals and their land. Upon further reflection on my research, I also found an Aboriginal live theatre organisation in Brisbane named Spirits of the Sand. They actively provide people with an authentic Aboriginal storytelling experience. They speak of storytelling as having two different functions. The first being that stories actively reside within the land and create a median between human and land. The second function is to reinforce and strengthen Aboriginal identity through a sense of belonging. As stated previously, stories in Indigenous culture are embedded within the land and have been since the Dreamtime. It is evident that these two elements of story and country are then intertwined. What does this mean for young Aboriginal students? Well, a sense of belonging is crucial for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. In this case, a belonging that subsequently informs a sense of identity. In their article on Aboriginal identity in education settings, Shea and Wicks highlight that the nurturing of identity is acknowledged through the literature as being a critical factor in supporting Aboriginal young people to remain engaged in education in Australia. When reflecting upon prior education, Marnie Shea, an Indigenous elder, emphasised a sense of apathy within herself toward all forms of education. This apathy stemmed not from a loss of self-identity, but rather having, as she quotes, nowhere for me to express my identity in an affirming way. This then begs the question, what do we mean when we say inclusion? This thought provoked me to reflect upon inclusion as being an active process wherein student engagement must be exercised. Inclusion and active engagement with one's identity is an intertwined dynamic, one in which neither element can flourish while the other is neglected. How are these themes then significant and relevant to my future role as a teacher? To tie my analysis back into its core inquiry, my idea of positively influential teaching hinges upon the ability to engage the learner. Learners engage through their identity and individuality being brought forward within a class. To not fully understand each student's identity is to deprive them of a uniquely adapted learning experience that has the capacity to unlock each student's academic and social potential. Why is this important? It is my job as a future teacher to develop each individual student within the class to their full potential, both academically, socially, and emotionally. This can only be established through fully understanding and identifying the uniqueness in each student and developing specific adaptations in accordance with the needs of each student. So if identity is key, how do we find out their identity? And how can we then tap into this individuality in order to promote reconciliation, inclusion, and engage learners throughout the classroom? Anthony McKnight highlights the necessity for pre-service teachers to first unearth their own initial interconnecting spiritual story with country before learning to teach Aboriginal culture, as it can aid in developing a relationship with the localised Aboriginal experience and further strengthens an ability to connect with Indigenous students through associating and tying in with their identity. SHIP then affirms the notion that embedding Indigenous perspectives in the classroom has been shown to actively improve Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students' attendance, engagement, participation, and pathways into further education and work, thus underlying the necessity for significant elements of Indigenous culture, such as country and storytelling, to be a foundational point from which learning experiences take their shape. On the other side of our role as a teacher, there is the socio-emotional element. SHIP then goes on to reaffirm and further address the point that improving relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians can only be achieved through reconciliation via education and exposure to each other's perspectives. The relevance and significance of these elements of Indigenous culture in relation to student engagement and inclusion have been highlighted, but how can we, as teachers, practically incorporate such an approach into the curriculum? The first point to note when analysing pedagogical components of a quality Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander education is the richness of the content at hand. SHIP talks about the notion of tokenism, wherein in this context, Indigenous education is only promoted through a symbolic effort to merely give the appearance of inclusion and engagement. SHIP then challenges us to ask the question, was the learning experience a rich one that advanced the students' intercultural knowledge and understanding in some way, or was it merely a tokenistic effort? When introduced to this idea, my first reaction was a recognition of how this thought process highly supported the notion that a student's ability to experience elements of reconciliation, inclusion, and engagement is purely based upon teacher pedagogy. Tyson Younger-Porter developed a proposition for an 8-way Aboriginal pedagogy framework, wherein 8 modes of learning are represented. According to Younger-Porter, each concept represents the pedagogical common ground between many cultures, intercultural ways of learning that any teacher and learner might approach together as familiar territory from their own cultural standpoint. The 8 concepts are story sharing, learning maps, non-verbal, symbols and images, land links, non-linear, deconstruct and reconstruct, and community links. From here, we can see that our 2 key themes that have been discussed and analysed so far throughout the presentation, country and story, are both present as a pedagogical framework for learning, country being represented through land links and story through the story sharing concept. A key attribute for this learning framework is its ability to focus on a pedagogical approach rather than an organisational tool for content. In other words, this framework informs how to teach as opposed to what to teach. Younger-Porter also highlights the interrelatedness of the pedagogies, which we can see through the connected lines down the middle of the framework's illustration. If we pick one of these 8 concepts within this framework, for example, a non-verbal approach, we can see a wide variety of opportunities to link intercultural ways of learning. Specifically embedding such an approach into the Australian curriculum can be seen to take place from within a variety of different learning areas. We can see here that in years 3 to 4, students are tasked with exploring the use of body language in the arts and facial expression to create roles and situations, Delving further into this content descriptor, we can see that experimenting with body language from different cultures is an elaboration of this descriptor, and so creating a positive environment for both students of Indigenous and non-Indigenous backgrounds to create and learn through a shared concept that can actively be expressed in unique manners. On further exploration of this learning area, we can see that not only are non-Indigenous students given the opportunity to explore the deep richness of Indigenous culture, but they are also able to analyse and reflect upon such traditions through the specific concept of, in this instance, non-verbal learning. As we can see in the elaborations of this content descriptor, viewpoints are considered from differing cultures and societies, thus exemplifying Yunkaporta's ideology of Indigenous and non-Indigenous common ground being founded upon pedagogically familiar territory, which is approached from each student's own cultural standpoint. From here, we can then see that the apathy Shay felt toward education, that feeling of hopelessness toward her expression of identity within her school, is broken down. Through this pedagogical framework and interconnection with learning areas through the curriculum, Aboriginal identity is not only expressed, but further, given an active pathway for such expression to take place. And back to the 3 questions at hand. I have conducted a critical analysis into the themes of country and story, as well as personally reflected upon such research. I have also examined the significance and relevance of these themes, as well as Indigenous education in a broader context, to my future role as a teacher. I have also further identified practical strategies to aid efficacy of Indigenous inclusion and active engagement within the class. I hope this presentation serves as an educational tool for teachers to actively pursue an informed understanding of the significance and relevance of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander perspectives within the classroom. Thank you.